Okay. Hi, everybody. Good morning. It's nice to see everybody, sort of. I can't really see you, but it's nice to know that you're there. So this is our second of our monthly webinar series. Each month we'll pick a topic that seems relevant to the big subjects, and we'll explore it together. And for those of you who this is your first time, I'll just walk us through a handful of slides just to sort of level set and get some basics out there and some stuff for us to react to as a group. And then pretty quickly, hopefully within, say 15 minutes or so, we'll open up for conversation, discussion, Q&A. So along the way, you look at your little control panel, you should be able to see a little hand icon. If you click that, it'll be you raising your hand. And then down the road, Sonia will call on you and unmute you. Alternatively, if you don't want to speak and want to stay anonymous, you're welcome to type in your question into the computer too. And then we can read your question. All right, so that's the basic gist of how it works. One question here is, these are meant to be intimate. These are meant to be a safe place. And so everyone, first of all, these subjects are loaded for each of us in different ways. So all emotion is welcome here. And also we need to ask that we respect each other's privacy and keep this a closed circle for this time that we're together. Just the basics of privacy and respect. And again, meant to be an intimate environment. I'm a little on the fence of whether to call people out by name. My leaning would be to at least call on you by first name. I hope that's all right with folks. If you type in your question, you can of course stay anonymous that way. And if you definitely don't want me to mention my name, you can mention that in your typed question. So anyway, I hope that makes sense. But let's get started in earnest, guys. Well, again, thank you for coming. I'm very excited about this series. It's such a lovely way to interact from afar. So here we go. Caregiving, that's what we're here to talk about. Right out of the chutes, there's something, this often happens with the language and this stuff. Words aren't adequate. I think those of us who have been around caregiving know that it flows in both directions. Caregiving and care receiving go together. And there's the person who's the patient and there's the caregiver, but that makes it sound like it's this sort of one-way street. So forgive our English language, we'll try to come up with better words, but just to note, right out of the chutes, caregiving has to go in all directions. All right. So what is this role of a caregiver? What does it mean? Well, literally, obviously, you are providing care. You are caring for someone, sometimes caring at someone. This may be someone you love. This may be someone to whom you feel an obligation or a debt. This may be someone you don't feel you have any choice but to care for. This may be someone you get paid to care for. All of the above. And of course, each of those dynamics may have a different color or different flavor. But these are relationships, I guess, is the thing to get across. And so they'll be unique to the dynamic between you and the person you're caring for. And I'd like to say loved ones, caregivers. A lot of family members don't see themselves as caregivers, though that's what they're doing. I'd say loved ones are family, but that also leaves some folks out. So again, language is tricky. All of the above, and each of those dynamics will have its own gist. So it is a big thing to sign up for. In general, in our context of serious illness and chronic illness, these can be relatively long engagements. That's the right word. Those of we know we are living longer and longer with serious illness nowadays, months, years. So it's a big deal. And there are at this point something between 45 and 50 million informal caregivers in this country, informal meaning unpaid. And that's mostly what we're speaking to here. And that's happening sort of on the side or quietly under the table in a way. And a lot of these caregivers are also trying to hold down jobs and tend to their own kids or their own lives or their own marriages, et cetera. So it gets very complicated. And this is one of those smoldering issues in the US where our healthcare system doesn't really address this big need. There's no training, there's no regulatory sort of function around this stuff. So it's a big and growing problem in a way. And the problem here is how do you stuff this piece of your into your life while trying to tend to the rest of it. So that's part of what we'll talk about today. And psychological framing, that's just a little phrase to remind ourselves what I already said, that this is, I would encourage all of us to not, we can't see caregiving in purely sacrificial terms. I mean, maybe you can do that for a day or a week or something and kind of bite your lip and just kind of get through it and put the rest of your life on hold. But for the most part, that doesn't fly. It does not fly for very long. So we got to find a way to make this part of the daily routine of your life, part of how you care for yourself, part of how you see yourself in the world, not just this tacked on thing that you can squint through and get through. Okay, so this is some of the sort of basic, what goes into caregiving? Well, many things, and obviously situation dependent. For example, caregiving for someone with dementia can be very importantly different from caregiving for someone who, say, has an infection or a more time-limited issue. But much of the time, you will be hitting on these things called ADLs, or activities of daily living. And these are official designations. So we'll talk about these in formal sense, just so we can understand the job here, the role. But just so you know, these ADLs are important in the insurance world. So if someone needs help in all ADLs, they then may qualify for home care, for example. So there are technical repercussions to this, to the need for ADLs, to the degree of dependency. So just know that much. There's some significance in the insurance plane, but for the work we're talking about at home, these are just sort of the mechanics, a way of understanding the mechanics. So there's bathing, of course, and this is maybe one of the most important. I think those of us who've been patients or dealt with illness, one of the great indignities is that we end up sort of sitting in our own filth. And bathing, turns out, across cultures, across time, is a beloved, basic, fundamental human social engagement, but also a basic station for ourselves. So it is not a small thing. This is not just to take care of body odor per se. And this is a big deal. It's tending to the body, cleaning the body, in that way, respecting, revering the body. So very important work. Dressing. Probably don't need to describe too much of that, but there too, I mean, think of these things in terms of beyond just function, but think of them in qualitative terms. You can imagine how any of us feel like when I've got my best duds on, or when I've showered and cleaned up, it just puts me in a different state. They're not small stuff. And it can also be when people are feeling, our patients, people we're caring for, feel kind of removed from so much of the daily life. It can be really powerful to kind of dress up for the day, even if you go nowhere and are seen by no one. So don't underestimate it. Eating, nutrition, getting food prepared in the mouth or in the feeding tube or in the vein of the person we're caring for. Again, basic sustenance here. Transferring and moving. Well, let me step back for a second to eating. Another thing to kind of be aware of for ourselves as caregivers is how charged the eating thing can be. Very often people who are dealing with illness are not in a position, can't eat, sometimes mechanically. Oftentimes their appetite is suffering. Their sense of taste can be altered by chemotherapy and other things, radiation therapy, infection, etc. And so while eating is, nutrition, nutrients is considered so fundamental to life, well, it can be very distressing when the person you're trying to care for, won't eat, can't eat. And I've seen so many families sort of really lose it around this point because it's primal. And so something to be aware of. And there are times in the course of an illness where really putting food into somebody is not a good idea. We can talk more about that, but that's something to note here for ourselves. But next, transferring and moving, well, this is where a lot of injuries happen. So caregiving in some ways can be this is overwrought, but I was gonna say a dangerous endeavor. It can be very physically taxing. This is where it can be very, very helpful to get some training from a physical therapist, etc. Find a way to move well with someone, to lift someone well, to use your legs instead of your back, and how to use someone's weight to generate momentum, etc. This is something to be very, very leery and careful of as caregivers. This is where so many of our injuries are sustained. And just know there are techniques to helping someone transfer and move. And sometimes that may require getting durable medical equipment like a Hoyer lift to actually mechanically lift someone out of the bed, like with a crane. So this runs a gamut on this one. This one is noted most noteworthy here again for our self-care. Be careful to not injure ourselves. Toileting, going to the bathroom, basic, essential, of course. And something toileting can be difficult because it often requires transferring. Sometimes a bedpan can do the trick, but transferring to a bedside commode, it's a cheap piece of durable medical equipment, which takes some getting used to, but actually can be a wonderful thing when trying to get someone out of the bed, ambulate or roll into a bathroom, transfer to a toilet, etc. There's a lot of action there. So bedside commodes can be a godsend, but one way or another, you're going to be helping to move someone. So that gets tricky. And that also means sometimes caregivers accidentally or subconsciously happy to forget about the person's need for toileting, especially the person's not communicative and they're not asking for it. It can go by the wayside. And this is where people can live with days of constipation. That's a big, big deal. That can be really upsetting to a patient physically. That can cause shortness of breath, pain, nausea, delirium even. So this is something to really watch ourselves and not accidentally or casually brush aside. Related, of course, is continence and helping someone deal with incontinence. And incontinence is very common, whether urinary or bowels. So these are technically the ADLs. Again, some significance for the insurance world, but for our purposes, this is just a way to understand the physical job of caregiving. So that's some of the physical stuff, but there may be no more important role. I don't mean to set up some hierarchy here, but it is a very significant part of the job to see oneself when they're a caregiver as an advocate. You're not just sort of as needed there for people's needs. In some ways, especially these days, especially working around and within the healthcare system, which can be so harsh, unintuitive, and sometimes even dangerous. Hospitals are not places you want to end up in casually, etc. So healthcare system does amazing things, but you really need to advocate for yourself. Most of us on this call probably know this from firsthand experience. Gone are the days where you can just hand yourself over to your doctor and know that doctor knows you deeply and well, and knew your parents and knows your kids, and has the time to think through what you need. You may find that haphazardly, but even with really beautiful, well-intended physicians, there's no time or space for that. So it's really dangerous to presume that your doctor's just going to take care of all your needs and just hand yourself over to the healthcare team and away you go. It is a much more active role, both being a patient and a caregiver. And the word advocate is really high on the list of your jobs, really, as a caregiver. To proactively look around the corner on behalf of your patient, to seek what you know they need, and not just wait for it to come. This requires, of course, a sort of physical, mental chutzpah. You kind of push it sometimes. Sometimes that it can tip into almost an activism, it can feel like. So this is no small piece of the job. Emotionally and psychologically can be very taxing, but also can be very, very rewarding and empowering in a way. And it also can send such a loving signal to the person you're trying to care for. I think many of us have been on the receiving end of that kind of support from someone else looking out for us. It's a wonderful thing. So that's sort of the spirit of advocacy. And then this word proxy, very often, that has more technical meaning. So a proxy, or the durable power of attorney for healthcare, This is when someone who has been deputized in a way, when you're a caregiver, when you've been designated to make decisions on behalf of that patient. So then you're not only supporting the patient per se, but you are actually speaking on their behalf, making choices on their behalf. That's a whole other level too of work. It can be increased, it can be very intensive. And that requires not forgetting yourself, but putting this other person's needs first. And that gets hard and beautifully important. Okay, well, self-care for caregivers. So, right, this is what I want to start with, this idea of caregiving and receiving that need to happen all together. There's a phrase that I've been taught called pathological altruism, and I see it all over the place in the health professions and in just good caring people, where there's so much need and there's so many gaps in the systems that are meant to support us, that as a caregiver, it feels like I can't, there's no time for me to care for myself. And it can feel even shameful, like my job is to care for somebody else, not myself. I'll sleep when I'm dead kind of phrasing. Where this idea that you don't need anything as a caregiver, your job is just give. Well, no, don't swallow that. Don't take that. That does not work for more than a few hours, really. And the healthcare system is littered with people who took on that mantle and found themselves burned out and crusty and scarred. So a big frame shift here, guys, is to understand that your job, even if your job is to be the best caregiver in the world, I would still say job number 1 or 2 for you is taking care of yourself, because you are an instrument of care for another person. Therefore, there's consequences to how well you are feeling, how well you are doing. So you have to elevate your own care right next to, in some ways above, the care of the person you're charged with caring for. That's a heck of a sentence. Because if you're empty, if you're toast, there ain't nothing you can give. So this is really, really key. We need to remind ourselves of this again and again, because caregiving over time can be really hard. It can really yank on you. So if you don't uptick your own needs, you will be steamrolled right over. And not only will that feel crappy for you, that feels terrible for your patient, the loved one, the person who on some level will be aware that you're wrung out on their behalf. And that's where it starts creeping in, this infamous word of being a burden. And so many of us as patients feel like we're a burden. Number one reason people want to hasten their own deaths is because they feel like they're a burden. So you as a caregiver can push back on that by finding some joy in your work as a caregiver and some pride in it, and including caring for yourself. That will help your patient, in indirect and direct ways. Okay? And that will tamp down that penchant for them to feel like a burden. All right. So we'll come back to this one. Anyway, so that's our sort of overview dealio. Let me pull this panel back up. And let's cut to questions, guys, or comments. Anyone want to share their experiences or whatever it may be? Let me get out of the slides here.
It looks like we do have one hand up. Anya, if you want to ask a question, I'm going to unmute you real fast. Okay, you should be unmuted, Anya.
Thank you. I am a physical therapist, and I work in a outpatient cancer rehabilitation setting. And I find that I have a lot of patients who come to me who do not have a palliative care provider. And so I try to make that recommendation, and I'm wondering, in terms of timing, what do you recommend? When is the best time to do that? Great
question, Anya. Thank you. So palliative care, for those on the call who don't know, that's my field. That's the profession, the growing sort of healthcare profession that is really concerned around quality of life and treating suffering rather than disease. And this is, and as such, it is, as a field, is very much a field of advocacy. Sorry about that. So that's a little bit of what palliative care is. And as you're suggesting here, palliative care can be incredibly important piece of the mix. When you're in the acute care mode, you got multiple specialists on a patient, oftentimes no primary care to kind of quarterback things. That can be left to you, the caregiver. And one of the ways to get a lot of help very quickly is to get a palliative care team involved. So the problem is palliative care isn't very well represented across the country. There are places, often metropolitan areas, that have a pretty good smattering of palliative care programs. They are often housed within a health system or a hospital system. So the first thing to do would be to ask the person's physician, primary care physician, or any of the physicians, or screw the physician, ask the social worker or the nurse, if you can get a hold of them, whether or not there are palliative care services. Someone in that system should know. It shouldn't be a hard question to answer. And if you can also, if that doesn't get you anywhere, there's a website called getpalliativecare.org where you can type in your location and you'll see what palliative care programs are available, and then you can just call those programs directly. Sometimes those programs will require, often will require a doctor's referral, and some of those programs are limited about what diseases they are willing or able to, not willing, that are able to see. So there are limitations, program dependent. So it's a bit hot. I will say, I have to say here, this is exactly why, or so much of why, Sonia and I have started Mental Health, which is online palliative care counseling and coaching, so that you don't need a referral from a doctor, and you can, even if you live somewhere where there's no palliative care program for miles, you have access to this kind of advocacy and this kind of support online. So anyway, that's a big whirlwind kind of overview about palliative care and ways to get it involved. But Anya, back to your question too here, I would say it's never too soon to at least inquire of palliative care. Is that coming from do you guys hear some feedback? Can you hear someone maybe need to mute? Anyway, or maybe it's coming from me. Anyway, one big question is, even if you got palliative care program, sometimes the question is, when to involve palliative care? Often comes up in around hospice, like when to involve hospice, which is a subset of palliative care, at the end of life, in the final months of life. So in both cases, hospice, that subset of palliative care, or palliative care writ large, I would encourage you guys, especially in the advocate, with your advocate hat on, to inquire before there's a need for palliative care. Inquire what the palliative care options are for you. And this way you can kind of prepare and plan, and you can know what's coming. So if you are armed on you, if you know that, in my system, I've got a palliative care program that's open to people with cancer, a heart disease, or any other disease, and I've called them and they do take my insurance, or they, whatever it is, then you're ready to go. And when that moment when it feels like you need more support, then you can call that palliative care program and away you go. And you don't have to overthink it. Like I say, most people wait way too long and suffer way too long needlessly. So I would, when in doubt, call palliative care. You can oftentimes have one meeting with them, a consult with that program, and they can tell you what they can offer, and they can help you can get started helping you in all sorts of ways. Or again, meet you, they're there, they're in the background, and when you need more help, it's just easy to bring them in. So bottom line, I would encourage all of us, in any caregiver capacity for someone who's seriously ill or chronically ill, find out the palliative care programs in your area, reach out to Mental Health, and do it sooner than later. I've never met anyone who's regretted involving palliative care too soon. I've only met people who regret involving palliative care too late. Does that get at your question, Anya? It was quite a ramble, but did I answer you? Are you there? Well, I will assume that we did.
Yes, you did.
Okay, thanks, Anya.
Okay, we've got quite a few other hands up, so I'm going to try to go in the order that you guys raised them, so I apologize if I skip over anyone. Leslie, I think you had your hand up next. I'm going to unmute you right now. Go ahead, Leslie. You should be unmuted.
Maybe not. Oh, am I now? Hello?
There you are.
Hi, BJ. I'm Leslie. I'm from the UK. So the question may be slightly different. The answer to the question may be slightly different in the US. But I'm interested in your thoughts around sort of care partners, particularly as people approach end of life, the family who care for the person in terms of person and family centered care. How do you see the kind of care partnership and the balance between encouraging people to be part of that and be an advocate and sort of be involved versus the kind of, I hate saying the word burden, but the burden that that might bring?
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Nice to hear that voice from across the pond. It's a big question, and certainly because there's truth to, let's just start with this scary or loaded word, burden. I mean, the truth of it is life's burdensome. We are, and by some narrow definition of that word, we are burdens to one another, in various ways. That's I think a very uninspired way of seeing it, but I also I say that to kind of just, let's try to be honest with each other. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of time to be a good caregiver, and so I guess I want to normalize this feeling of being a burden and kind of try to kind of shift it, reframe it. In some ways, it's just that's sort of wrongly conceived. We get to be a burden to one another. We get to need one another. We get to rely on one another. And some of the most beautiful things you'll see happen in family dynamics is when, say a family, the parents took care of the kids. Kids have grown up. The parents are at their later stages of life, and now the sort of roles get to reverse. And those kids can exercise all that those parents taught them about caregiving. And then the family, the elders, can be on the receiving end more, even as they're giving of their wisdom and of their time. And this is why it's really tricky to kind of find the right, just as you were doing, Leslie, is inching up on that word. So there's some truth to it, but that is the nature of being human. We need each other. There is no such thing. There's no one who doesn't need something from somebody. There's no one who, by some definition, isn't a burden in some way. That burden, being a burden, is being alive. So that's not quite at your question, but I want to open that up a little bit. But otherwise, I will see in my job in palliative care, very often the caregiver, the family member, ends up being my patient in a way. Sometimes the patient's needs are kind of clear and they're on their way. But the caregiver is suffering more than the patient. And very often it's common that in palliative care and hospice, the caregiver, the family members, end up being the patient in a way, or the focus of our energy, supportive energy. So that's another point. I think the general gist here, though, Leslie, is, it's family dependent, situation dependent, and never mind family. Not everyone has family. So let's put family in quotes: friends, neighbors. I think the trick here is to just speak openly and honestly, and safely, and sharing our concerns. If we're all really clicking along, and if we're all self-aware, we know that that being alive is being a burden on some level, and that we get to care for each other, not have to care for each other, and that each of us has limitations. So just frank, open conversation about all that is really key. And last point I have to say on that for now, Leslie, is, sometimes families get overwhelmed. I've met many families, right, who have all the love, but their lives are just incredibly complicated, and they're dealing with incredibly complicated illnesses that would have killed someone 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, but now you can live with machines all over the place. And it's It is, what's the word for I'm looking for here? Anyway, it's just a lot of work. And my point here is that sometimes, despite best intentions, we need to call in help. Sometimes that may be hiring a home health aide, calling in neighbors. And one of the basic things that we need to do as caregivers, sometimes your job as a caregiver is to bring in more care, to bring in more help for yourself, for your person, etc. And there's no shame in that. That's just the nature of life these days. It gets a little hard because sometimes not everyone has the resources to hire a $20 or $30 an hour aide. Not everyone has a network of friends and neighbors, in which case, as ever, you're just doing the best you can. But this would be a reason, for example, to call in home hospice sooner than later. One way or another, whether it's AIDS or hospice or palliative care program, blah, 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 neighbors. The point here is it's okay to ask for help. You need to ask for help. And there's no shame in that. That's just part of the deal. So, okay, sorry, Leslie, I'm going on and on, but those are some thoughts. I think the bottom line here is to elevate the role of the family right next to the patient. There's no one, all needs are a priority.
Thank you, BJ.
Thank you, Leslie.
Okay, let's see. Lisa, I think you had your hand up next. I'm going to unmute you now. Okay, Lisa, you should be able to speak now. Lisa, you still there? Okay, we'll try you in a second.
Got it.
There you go. Hi, Lisa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yep.
Okay, hi, sorry. My name's Lisa, I'm from Canada. And I'm the daughter of a caregiver. And so my mom has dementia and my dad has been her caregiver for about 5 years now, which is of course getting harder and harder and harder. I have 2 siblings and we're sort of helping the best we can. We're all in our 40s and 50s. And I guess the question I would have is around my dad having his own health problems now, heart problems, anxiety, depression, and really not connecting those problems with being a caregiver. So, and I'm finding it sort of bewildering because the response is often, oh, we have such a great family helping me, you know, care for mom and da da da. I have nothing to be concerned about. You know, I'll just go to the doctor for more pills and this and that, and not really connecting the health problems with being a caregiver. And it's really challenging to sort of, I actually don't even know quite how to respond. So thanks for listening. And I will say I'm working through your book around the beginner's guide to the end, and it's really phenomenal. And maybe there's a Canadian partner somewhere that could put that kind of thought and work into how things work here in Canada, because our health system is different. So just a thought.
Wow. Thank you, Lisa. I'd love to. Yeah. Love to find a partner to tweak that book for Canada specifically. But, you know, to your big point here, you know, I wonder, this is where life subjectivity and each of us getting to have our own styles, our own takes on things is so important and messy and wonderful. So I guess one question, as I hear you recount the story of your parents, is do you think your dad knows as much, but just the way he sees himself, his sense of pride, he doesn't want to link his health issues to the act of caregiving because he, in his way of thinking, that may somehow, you know, besmirch his relationship to your mom? You know, is there a pride around that? Is your dad sort of with a wink not acknowledging the health implications because he'd rather focus on his love for your mom or something like that? Or is it more something akin to denial?
I think it would be more akin to denial. It really does seem like, you know, I have such a great family. What do I have to worry about? And so I'm struggling with kind of a response, because I'm sort of, I guess, looking on the outside going, how do you not connect the dots between caring for someone who's, 5 years into dementia now, it's really, really challenging, with having heart problems and anxiety. And I think it's denial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and denial is a toughie, right? Because it serves a purpose. It may be, you don't poke a hole in denial lightly. But depending on the dynamic, it may just be a series of, not just one conversation, but a series of conversations. Oftentimes it's helpful to not to decharge it a little, like take down the load, have a cup of coffee, go for a walk, drive in the car. Not like, Dad, we need to talk, just sort of more casually opening up on multiple occasions, chipping away. Hey, Dad, I'm worried about, I worry about you, gosh, life's hard enough. I wonder how we can get some help for you, or how are you taking care of yourself these days, Dad? Or, these are just shotgunning here. Chipping away, it often happens over time that you kind of plant these little seeds, that you make it clear that to your dad that his health's important, how he's feeling is important in this mix, etc. You sort of demonstrate that with your questions and your love. And, over time, he might start letting that in. And that's oftentimes how denial can be diffused in a functional and constructive way. So that's one thought. You might, if depending on his relationship with his own doctor, sometimes depending on that dynamic, you can front load with the doctor or his medical team and be at his appointment and ask the doctor his opinion. Hey, doc, when I look at my dad, your dad may be sitting right there, I have to say I'm worried that the work of caregiving is contributing to his anxiety or whatever it is. So you can pop that in front of the doctor, or you can call the medical team and see if they'll bring it up themselves. So it gets you out of the middle. That can get a little fuzzy, but that can happen. And get professionally, get the professionals doing their job. So those are some thoughts. And lastly, I would say, Lisa, you can do all those things, and it just may be that your dad just never is willing to kind of link them up for whatever reason, and despite all your efforts. And it just may be the way things go. And you'll just be left with the one basic thing of just, okay, Dad, I'm just going to keep on loving you,
Yeah.
That may be all you can do, and that's a ton.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So let's see, we have some questions here. Susan, you asked a while back, let me just read that. How can I ask proxy advocate reframe, let's see, how can I ask proxy advocate reframe the term hospice palliative care in a way that is more palatable to patients who fear it, that it means there is no hope? So if I'm not sure I'm reading your correct question quite right, Susan, but I think I'm hearing you ask, how do you reframe this sort of hospice and palliative care so that it's more palatable to patients? I think that's the question here. You're asking the gazillion-dollar question in our field. It's odd. I thought I've watched myself and many others in the field, and people, organizations, foundations try to lean into some messaging around this field, and it remains such a problem. And I don't, at this point, I don't even understand it anymore, why we struggle so much. It has something to do with the baggage of hospice, because hospice connotes death, and death freaks people out. That's the basic gist here. But you're asking a zillion-dollar question. I can just say, this is at Mental Health. Sonia and I are playing with this now in our materials. Like, we are providing palliative care. That is what we're doing. But some people that language might get in the way. So we're not dogmatically attached to saying we are palliative care. Let's just care. Let's just provide this kind of support, this emotional, psychological support, this kind of love, and leave the word palliative care out of the mix. So anyway, I don't have a great answer. But one phrase that lights up in the field is, hey, you know, it looks like you might need an extra layer of support. You know, that's a phrase that has gotten some traction. Who wouldn't want an extra layer of support? And that's what palliative care offers. Sometimes, so that's one phrasing. Sometimes around the idea of hospice, I've had good luck saying, just acknowledging it and saying, hey, team, hey, family, hey, guys, patient. Hospice, I know hospice has some baggage to it, but let me just take a moment to tell you, hospice palliative care, there's nothing about hastening death. The whole idea is to help people live until they die. And very often people live longer in hospice or palliative care and blah, blah, blah. So sometimes I'll just sort of directly go to the baggage, speak to the baggage and say, the bottom line about hospice is, you know, you can sign right off if it doesn't feel good, if it doesn't feel right to you. Most people love it. Most people wait too long and regret waiting so long. But look, it's the way to get the most services into your home. So that's where I'm going here. So when I hear a family say, I really, really want to be at home, then that gives me an inroads to say, well, hospice, you may not like the language, the word of hospice, but it is the way to get the most services into your home. And I've gotten some families who say, okay, well, we don't like the word, but okay, we'll take hospice because we want the help. So those are some basic thoughts, but the bottom line, and just describe the care, never mind the language. Describe, looks like you can use some extra support, emotional, psychological support, some practical support. Let's see what we can find. Let's see what our health system offers. So tricky stuff though. This is rhetorical suffering we all have. I see a question here, a comment from Darcy that may elucidate further. Darcy says, one thing that is helpful for this question, research often shows that folks with palliative care actually live longer than folks who continue treatment. Without palliative care should be the rest of that sentence. So yeah, Darcy, right on. So there's interesting data that suggests not only does palliative care not hasten death, it actually helps you live longer. I can't guarantee that if you get palliative care, you will live longer, but it makes sense. If you're supported and your needs are addressed and you have someone accompanying you through all the twists and turns of the healthcare system, it would make sense. It would make sense that you're going to live longer, right? You're de-stressed the situation. So anyway, back to Darcy's point. Yeah, Susan, you can invoke the data to say, hey, if you're thinking that palliative care is going to shorten your life, In fact, the data suggests it may actually help you live longer. And that can get you far too. Okay, back to you, Sonia. I think there's some more hands up and we don't have all that much more time.
Yeah, we've got a few more hands up that I want to get through. Andrea, if you still have a question, I'm going to unmute you right now.
Okay.
There you are.
BJ.
Andrea.
I was on a study at USC about, they had a big grant from PCORI to take a look at the community health centers and patients and the relationship to inviting extra help into the home. And it didn't work out real well. The patients really resisted and a lot. So from another perspective, from the patient's perspective, they have pride. There's a sense that burden thing is not minor at all. A sense that there's a more tenuous relationship between life and death, and independence. The giving up of it kind of signals you're losing some of your ability to take care of yourself and your independence. And they found alternative ways to try to get people in to get to talk to patients about it, you know, like spiritual people to say, you know, to reframe it and get somebody in their garden and to talk about their gardening and kind of defuse the whole idea of what needing help. But I don't think it's a minor thing either way. And I think that there may be some patient education we need to do also about what's going on. And no doubt hospice sets off bells and whistles big time. And in terms of, am I dying? You're giving me hospice means I'm dying.
Yeah.
And it's really stuck. I mean, whether it's true or not, I mean, that's what goes on. It seems to go on. And so the messaging is really important, because you're right. I think people will flourish more and thrive more, but I think language is critical.
Amen, Andrea. Thank you. Nice to hear your voice.
Hi.
This and that's these things are, it's complicated, and so part of it is right on. I'm with you in everything you're describing here, and this is also why we all, if we, with our extra energy, and this is where I like the word from advocacy tipping into activism. If we bring up these issues into sort of daily life, into something more essential, then I think, it's also an indictment of society and how we think of ourselves. This idea of independence and autonomy, that we Americans are extra fetishized around that notion. But the problem is, I said earlier, independence doesn't exist. There's no such thing as someone who needs no one. It is a normal part of life, and even a glorious part of life, of how much we need one another. And there is no shame, and I, as a disabled person, there's no shame around needing help. That is the most natural, normal thing ever. And yet we live in a society that still implicitly, explicitly sort of denounces that as a lesser state. So part of what I hear your comments is we have some work at the structural level, the level of language, the level of society, the level of policy. So amen, yes, yes, yes. And then meanwhile, down in the trench, how do we find a way? How do we pry this stuff, this kind of care into each other's lives? It's just grunt work down here. We just need to these best we can do right now is acknowledge these forces at play and do our best to believe with them. I'll say one last thing on this point. We should get to we got some more hands up, but sometimes with a family, this happens a lot, like pride or whatever it is can kind of be gumming things up. And that person, the bottom line is they just need to get miserable enough to accept help. Like they have to, whatever is getting in the way of allowing help in, in some level, they got to scrape the barrel a little bit more and see like, okay, worse than my pride issue is just the fact that I can't get to the bathroom back, and let help in. Things got to get bad enough to let help in. And that's just sometimes the way it goes. Actually, my last point here is this is also why there's some thrill around telemedicine. And my ability now, one's ability to go into someone's home through their computer screen, it's not the same thing. It's got its huge limitations. But one thing that's nice, it's a way to kind of break the plane with someone around their privacy and their home base. They can control the aperture a little bit, but it's a way to begin to get into people's homes. Okay, so anyway, those are some thoughts, but let's move on to some more questions here, guys. Sonia, is our hand up?
Yeah, Susanna, your hand has been raised for a little while. Let me unmute you here. Go ahead, Susanna.
Thank you. So the slide about self-care really resonated with me because I have been a caregiver for someone who declined sort of on the longer term, as well as somebody who, as I put it, went over the waterfall. And when I found it easier to prioritize self-care with the caregiving experience that was more like floating down a river in an inner tube with a person. We hit a rock every once in a while, but we kind of knew what was coming. Whereas the waterfall was like panic mode for 2 weeks. So I love your observations about how to recognize self-care in those different situations, especially during the pandemic, because this last time, the waterfall time, was during this pandemic when I didn't want to let anybody into the house. So it was so difficult to figure out how to do self-care and ask for help when I also didn't want the virus to kill us. So would love your thoughts on that.
Oh, Susanna, thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is where a couple thoughts. It can be helpful to think through, it doesn't quite get at your question, but when you're trying to sort of forecast and your role as a caregiver to sort of see around corners like we were talking, this is where caregiver communication with the medical team can be really powerful around prognosis And sometimes a patient may have no interest in knowing the prognosis, but the caregiver really needs to know so they can sort of adjudicate their energies. And it's not always so tidy and things don't play out so in a way that you can plan for. But for example, if we know that the issue is dementia, that has a sort of a trajectory of decline over time. You can kind of guess how that's going to play out over time and the energies that you'll need to marshal over time. Versus something like end organ failure, like lung failure. If someone's got heart failure, for example, there'll be these sort of chronic coming along, like in that inner tube kind of zone, and then you'll have these waterfalls where all hell breaks loose. You're in the hospital, blah blah blah. So I guess one point here is to talk with the medical team and get facile with these anticipated sort of trajectories of decline, and the prognosis, so you can plan and prepare around it. That's one thought. And you may not know. You may just find yourself in a waterfall, and all you can do is try to get through it. It's sort of an acute mindset, and that's when you feel like you're just in battle. There's no reflecting on it. You're just pinging from need to need. And the best you can do is that just may be the state you're in. That can't last long. So if you find yourself in that waterfall for more than a week or two, that means you're actually into something more chronic, and you need to change your energies. You need to step back, reflect, and say, hey, I'm actually not in a waterfall. And even if I am in a waterfall, this is not sustainable. So we need to kind of reframe this. Because you can't just hang on and kind of get through things for months on end. And then lastly, your point about COVID is a really good one. And it just, all I can say is your job as a caregiver is treatment, medical care, it's littered with trade-offs. Everything's a trade-off. And so getting in that mindset, I think, is really important. And you're always dealing with some load. It's like the serenity prayer. You've got things you can change, you've got some things you can't change, and you just gotta sit with it. And so constantly reading the tea leaves and seeing, okay, where can I affect? Where can I change it? Where do I just need to be present? Where do I need to just like get out of the way? That kind of agility is really, really key. And I would just say COVID's just one more thing on a list of things that you can't control and that you need to stay present with. That's why so much of this job is being present with what is, not what you wish it to be. Just, it is what it is. Okay, here we are, COVID. Okay, it's this new variable on a list of variables that I can't control. So you do your best. Trade-offs at every turn. Nothing is perfect. Very often you are left choosing between the least of two shitty options, excuse my French, but that's very often what the math feels like. And that's just the way it is. So that's how you kind of bob and weave across time and space. And it's just clunky as hell. So that's my last point is it won't feel elegant all the time. Can't feel elegant all the time. That doesn't mean you're doing it.
Can I just say one of my mantras is to always forgive myself in advance. I try to forgive myself in advance all the time as a caregiver. And can I also, I just want to say something to our friend in Canada. I didn't remember the name. Yeah. So you're a caregiver, hon. Like you like the work that you're doing on behalf of your dad. Your dad is in the center of the circle, but you're in the second circle. You are a caregiver. And I just want to say, I've been there. I've been that daughter, and I really appreciate the work that you are doing as a caregiver.
That's so beautiful. Thank you, Susanna. Well, that may be the perfect way to end this session, guys. So I'm going to, actually, Susanna, it was a perfect segue too in a number of ways. Susanna's a good idea here. I'm gonna bring up this one last slide. We're gonna try this new thing of ending each of our little webinars, or whatever we call these things, with a question, a prompt, to have some through line beyond our hour together here to keep us thinking. And our question for this one is simply to ask you guys, name something that surprised you about caregiving, whether it was positive or negative, no value judgment, good or bad. And if you're into it, email us your answer, and then Sonia and I can collate that and put a note out to the group. Okay, so this would be a fun little exercise and keep us thinking and feeling. beyond the walls of this webinar. So thanks, Susanna, for that beautiful idea. Thank you guys so much for your participation. I hope you all got something from this.
Yeah.
This is not to solve, but ongoing. Let me cut back over to Sonia for some final thoughts.
Yeah, just some housekeeping here. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions. So Garrett, Ken, Susanna, and Tara, if you guys have, remaining questions, if you want to email that same info@metalhealth.com with your questions, we will record a second session that answers them. And for everybody who typed in their questions, Dory, Patricia, Dana, Susan, Lauren, Nancy, we're also going to record answers to those as well. So you'll get an email with this recording, and then there'll be a recording of the other answers. So we do want to make sure that we'll get to your questions. We just weren't able to get to them during this hour.
All right, guys. Well, such a pleasure. Thanks again. And let's just end on Susanna's beautiful of just loving one another for this beautiful job that we're doing, that we get to do. Hard and gorgeous. So lots of love, everybody. Thank you so much.